Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we have a very special episode for you guys. As I've mentioned before, one of the topics I've been wanting to touch on for quite some time now is spirituality and its relationship to the exploration of consciousness. I've been wanting to bring in someone who's experienced on the subject, who has personally trodden this road and discovered many interesting insights firsthand. And I'm convinced that for this purpose, no one could be better than today's guest. Today's guest is a rising and increasingly popular video creator in the area of meditation. He's had a long personal journey carrying out different spiritual practices and has been meditating for at least an hour every single day for the last 2 years. This last year, he decided to tweak the knob and increase the duration of his daily practice to 2 hours. This has led him to many interesting discoveries, epiphanies, and insights that he generously translates into practical advice for his viewers. His videos range from the discussion of meditation techniques to trauma healing and the nature of emotion, and overall just a bunch of really interesting topics. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure and delight that I give you Ethan Schaltegger. Ethan, how are you doing today?
Doing very well, Richard. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm super excited to be having you on. Um, so I guess like we could start by discussing a little bit more. I guess you could like perhaps introduce yourself, or like further talk about what you do and what brought you into meditation.
Yeah, I would love to. So it's great to be on the show again. Thank you. What got me into meditation? It's very interesting, and I think just in general, everyone's going to have their own path leading to meditation. So it is interesting when you meet other practitioners, just hearing other people's stories and seeing all of the different ways in which the practice comes into our lives. For me specifically, it was around 6 months before I was going to graduate from university. And so I was almost done with my degree at the time. In my last semester, my last 2 semesters were, for whatever reason, just a little bit easier than the preceding school years. So I had more time on my hand, and with more time, I just was researching things that interested me. And I also remember at the time I was really into philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of mind. So a particular field of metaphysics that I'm sure some of you listeners are familiar with. But philosophy of mind was really interesting. So I ended up taking a philosophy of mind class just as an extra credit, sort of extracurricular activity. And when we were, in class and discussing these theoretical concepts, it was very fascinating, very interesting. But I found that I just wasn't very satisfied with the answers or the discussions that we were having in the class, because on the one hand, yes, it was very fascinating listening to all of these different theories. On the other hand, I felt like there was just this tug in my gut that was telling me there's something more here. There's something more here that we're not getting to as a class, as a discussion point. And even when I would have discussions with my professor, like in office hours, one-on-one conversations, it just still felt like there was something missing. So on the surface, I'm taking this philosophy of mind class, but in the background, as I have more time, just when I'm hanging out by myself, not doing homework or anything, not hanging out with friends, I'm diving into YouTube videos or reading books or listening to podcasts. I remember at that point in my life, I'd found Sam Harris, who's a very popular
Yeah,
philosopher, meditation teacher.
yeah.
So his work was very influential for me at the time. But there was a real turning point with meditation, and that was I was listening to a podcast called the Future Thinkers podcast. For those that are interested, you can check out that podcast. It's a lot of cool stuff. But that podcast brought on a guest named Vinay Gupta, and this gentleman, he was very articulate, very rational, very grounded, and he was describing his experiences with meditation and specifically describing his experiences with enlightenment. So on the podcast, he was basically making a very bold claim about the nature of his own mind, the nature of his own consciousness, and making the claim that he was enlightened. And I remember listening and being very enthralled with that possibility, because this idea of spiritual enlightenment was not something that we talked about in the philosophy of mind class. The philosophy of mind class was it was oriented more towards Western philosophy. And this concept of enlightenment is very much an Eastern philosophical idea, although there are actually Western philosophers that speak in very similar language. If you do the research, you'll find them. But I would say it's more popular in Eastern philosophy, at least in this day and age. And so he's making these very radical claims, and it's very fascinating to me. And he basically says in the podcast, yeah, like anyone can become enlightened if you give it a good shot. That was kind of the way he phrased it. And I was like, all right, this is a very positive message. This sounds cool. And he went on to make a further claim and said, if you are really interested in seeing how to become enlightened, you need to practice meditation. And if you want to really see the fruits of meditation, really see what it can do for your life, meditate for an hour a day for 6 months. And at the end of those 6 months, you will then have the firsthand direct experience of whether or not this is a practice that you want to continue doing. And for whatever reason, that line of logic, that line of reasoning really resonated with me. It felt good. It felt right. And it felt better than what I was learning in my philosophy of mind class. And I don't mean to like badmouth it. It was a great class, but listening to this podcast, that felt like what I was ultimately seeking out of that class. And so I said, you know what, I'll give it a shot. So for the next 6 months, I really committed myself to meditating rigorously. Now, what makes this story even more interesting is that what happened at the end of the 6 months. So it was around January 2018 when I think that was the year when I first did this little experiment with meditation. And I was, meditating, doing my thing, was really consistent. So I'd meditate in the morning, go to school, come home, learn more about meditation, try to absorb more knowledge, information, get up the next day, repeat, meditate in the morning, go to school, etc. This was taking place over my last semester. And so as the 6 months are, really coming up, I started noticing that I was just having health problems. I noticed that I was getting extremely fatigued. I would have to come home from class and take like 2-hour naps. I mean, just really strange problems with my health. I would wake up in the middle of the night and just be incredibly thirsty. I would like pound down water, go back to bed, wake up a couple of hours later, pound down water, go to the restroom, and I would do that throughout the night. And then, like I said before, I'd come home, like crash for 2 hours. I was really into lifting weights at the time, and I noticed that I was just having a dramatic drop in my strength. For no reason at all. Nothing about the training had changed. Nothing about my diet had changed. But suddenly I just started like losing gains, losing strength. So I didn't really know what was happening. And at first, these changes in my health were very subtle, not too noticeable. I thought, I'm just stressed because I'm about to graduate, whatever. But then around 2 weeks before I was going to officially graduate, that's when my health really took like a pretty hard nosedive down. So I went to the emergency room, and long story short, I got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease called type 1 diabetes. And it was just really interesting timing because it wasn't exactly at the 6-month mark, but right around the 6-month mark of when I was supposed to end this, amazing meditation experiment, I get diagnosed with this incredibly brutal autoimmune condition. And I remember thinking in the hospital, like, oh my God, I'm so glad that I learned how to meditate, because I could feel just almost like the releasing of emotions and trauma in real time. I mean, it has been a very difficult journey in a lot of ways, and I'm definitely still processing the emotions of that event and whatnot. But I remember just viscerally feeling in my body that when I was able to apply mindfulness, when I was able to apply all of these principles that I'd been learning over these last 6 months with the practice to my own condition with this new disease or with this new illness, I was actually able to process those emotions in a way that I've never been able to in my life. And that life situation that got handed to me was firsthand experience very early on in my practice of the potential that this practice has for transforming our lives. And I'm not saying that I was like perfect at it necessarily, or that it was not painful, or that I haven't had challenges thereafter, emotionally speaking, related to this. But what I am saying is that I could feel directly the support that the practice provided. And so, in addition to meditation being an amazing tool for exploring consciousness and investigating very, very deep questions regarding the nature of mind and the nature of reality, it's also, I discovered a practice of healing, of happiness, of well-being and peace. And yeah, so I mean that's that's sort of a long ramble, but that's how I got involved in meditation. And then after the whole diagnosis with diabetes, it was like, oh man, I'm not going back. Like, I have all the proof I need to keep going. And so I've just been practicing very intensely ever since.
Wow, that's an incredibly interesting story. I guess there's just an element of, serendipity to it, like right when you were meditating, you come up with this illness, and you know as you know as through mere chance, I guess, or just the workings of the universe, you happen to have the mental and spiritual tools to like deal with the difficult emotions that would naturally come with like having to face this condition. um wow, it's, I guess there are so many there are multiple threads that we could pursue here. I guess just perhaps like to go a little bit back, one of the things that I wanted to ask you was like, um were you like, what sort of topics were you discussing in your philosophy of mind class, and were you able to, like, was it sort of like more subtle, like you couldn't quite put your finger on what exactly it was that like didn't fully satisfy you, or was it like, was there something specific that just didn't fully sort of like meet the criteria of what the class was supposed to be for you?
It's an interesting question. You, uh, Richard, you asking that question actually kind of reminds me of like, oh yeah, that I do remember actually what my dissatisfaction was with the class. There was a particular topic. I mean, we talked about all kinds of things. So like, we talked about the nature of identity. So like, something as simple as like A equals A, like what does that actually mean? We talked about like, I remember at one point, like we were talking about the distinction between like water and like the wetness of water and what differentiates those two. Does like wetness mean water, or like are they two separate things? Like how does that work? But I remember one of the topics in particular that we talked about was the distinction between materialism or physicalism. So I guess the ontological position that reality is made up of physical objects, and that's just the substrate of reality, essentially, is that it's all physical objects, and that's ultimately what the universe is made out of. Another position called Cartesian dualism, which is the ontological position that reality is made of both mind and matter. So the mind and matter interact in some sort of way, and that's what gives rise to our conscious experience. But I think most Cartesian dualists would suggest that physical matter gives rise to mind, and mind can interact with physical reality, but ultimately it is the brain that is giving rise to mental events, mental experience, etc. And then there was a third position called idealism. And idealism makes the claim that all of reality is mind. There is no such thing as physical reality. All of reality is just made up of mental substrates, experiences. And there is no hidden mechanism giving rise to the mind. And idealism is a little tricky to explain, I think, for a lot of reasons. But one is just because, I think a lot of people, and myself included, we all sort of walk around with this unconscious position of materialism, at least to some extent, like physical reality giving rise to the world in some sense or fashion. But during that class, what I found to be unsatisfying was, even before I got into meditation, actually, like this was pre-meditation, I had this insight that all of my experience was experience, which I know sounds a little redundant, but it was basically the insight that no, like the color red is not a physical object. Like, what is precisely the qualitative substance of red? If I was trying to describe what red is to someone who's colorblind, giving them all of the rational arguments in the world is not going to explain to them what red is. Like, on some level, until they have the experience of red, they're not going to be able to understand what red is. And that's what I was interested in exploring. And that seemed to be what both Cartesian dualism and idealism gave space for with. And I remember there was a specific conversation that I had with my philosophy of mind professor where I asked him, just in general, what is the mainstream academic philosophical position regarding these three positions? Like, is there a philosophical position that most philosophers bias towards? And he just flat out told me, he said, oh, yes, most certainly, most philosophers are physicalists. That's the mainstream position. And I just remember thinking, like, no, there's no way that can be the mainstream position. Like, it, for some reason, materialism slash physicalism as philosophical positions just really never made sense to me. And I think when I learned that was the bias in academic philosophy, and I also felt like there was a slight bias for that position, even in the way that we were framing our discussions in class, the types of emphasis that he would put on even those three positions. Like, we spent more time on physicalism and theories related downstream of, that position than the other two. I think that, in a sense, turned me off from academic philosophy. Now, in hindsight, I don't think it necessarily has to turn people off from mainstream philosophy, because there are most certainly mainstream philosophers that are advocating, or not advocating, but arguing for different positions that go against the mainstream. So I think it was more of a me thing than an academic philosophy thing. But I do remember that was sort of my beef with academic philosophy.
Right. My apologies for that. Yeah. Now that you've mentioned that, I'm sorry, I had a brief interruption. Yeah. Well, that's super interesting. And it reminds me of David Chalmers. I believe I once saw a video of David Chalmers where he was being interviewed by his name escapes me, but the fellow from the Closer to Truth YouTube channel. I think he's a neuroscientist. He was talking about like consciousness with David, who's the guy who came up with the zombie experiment, if I'm not mistaken. And my apologies for that. And David was citing certain polls of like different academic faculty and different philosophy departments, and he was mentioning precisely what you said, that the materialist outlook predominates in academia, specifically in philosophical faculties, philosophy faculties. But I mean, I guess there's just like so many avenues we could pursue. But I feel like you mentioned, right? Like there's a certain level of um embeddedness in the culture that we live in, that sort of presumes a naturalistic and materialistic world outlook. And even many thinkers that I very much admire, like Sam Harris, for instance, I've read like most of his books at this point. Um, Although I believe, I don't want to like misrepresent his views or anything, but like um, I, I believe he's significantly skeptical of 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 idealism. And there are people who, of course, like are very eloquent or articulate, like Bernardo Kastrup, Rupert Spira. They embrace an idealist worldview. But I feel like it's just like it's something that really just bogs my mind, right? Like the fact that there are like multiple thinkers that are all very prominent and very respectable, and they endorse or embrace like very different views, right? Like they both sound really compelling. Like when I hear or listen to Sam Harris express his skepticism of idealism, um, like he sounds pretty cogent, right? um, um, but at the same time, there's people who are like remarkably persuasive on the other side, and I guess it ultimately, it's, if I'm not, I mean, you've probably like read more about this than I have, but I'm guessing that the sort of Berkeleyan idealism that was espoused by Bishop George Berkeley, like I think he was like the original one of the original idealists. I'm guessing that's like sort of antiquated and old fashioned at this point. Like not many people subscribe to that particular iteration of idealism. I feel like people like Bernardo Castro have like a more sophisticated view. I mean, not to disparage George Berkeley, but um, I don't know. Like, do you have like any comments on that or?
Yeah, I'd like to highlight that point that you brought up about it. It's just interesting that all of these different amazing thinkers, persuasive individuals, articulate individuals, like have such competing ideas. I think that speaks to the very peculiar nature of the mind. Um, and I can just speak for myself for a moment as someone, I guess, who is an ex-materialist, because I was very much like I was I guess, the stereotypical like atheist, materialist, scientifically minded individual when I was younger. I think, I guess my views on this are that we we collectively, and this is a collective phenomena, don't give enough credit to just how powerfully and simultaneously subtly the human mind is shaping and creating our experience of the world. And so if we have any sort of metaphysical position, conscious or unconscious, that belief or that position is going to be shaping the way that we think and interpret data or interpret our experience. I mean, even the types of thoughts that we start having that we can observe in meditation, if you investigate the origins of many of those thoughts, you will discover underlying beliefs that gave rise to these seemingly spontaneous and random thoughts and beliefs and ideas and images or whatever, the mental activity that is on the surface of mind. Much of that activity's origins are in the forms of beliefs or philosophical positions that we may not necessarily know that we have or that we're operating within. And my personal opinion regarding why there are so many materialists out there, a couple of reasons. One, I think it's, again, because we don't have this understanding of the extent to which the mind is essentially manipulating our view of reality. We're not actually interested in investigating the mind deeply enough to then have really the internal authority to come to conclusions in an integrous way. I know that was a little bit strange how I just phrased that, but like, until we have a proper understanding of the human mind, of our own mind, we're really in not a position to be coming up with philosophical positions and making these radical claims about the nature of reality. Like, I think we kind of owe it to ourselves, and philosophers owe it to themselves, to really, really take seriously the power of the mind and what the mind is actually doing to our moment by moment experience, our literal creation of our sense of the world. So that's one thing. Number two, I think that because we haven't investigated deeply, or because we don't take seriously the extent to which the mind is creating reality, like, this leaves open a vacuum for exploration. And I think that's something that is just not on our collective radars as a society, as a people. Like, the fact that, I don't even remember what the telescope's name was, but there was this amazing telescope that NASA just recently launched into space. I mean, it literally thousands upon thousands of man hours went into this thing, and it was a success. Like, it was really awesome. They managed to launch this telescope successfully. It's going to be able to revolutionize the way that we take photos in space. But what people don't realize is that outer space, the infinity of outer space, is the internal landscape is just as infinite. The human mind and the states of consciousness that we can explore are truly just as infinite as the infinitude of outer space. And that's just not something that the mainstream knows or understands. And I question even mainstream meditation teachers. Like, how many mainstream meditation teachers are aware of just how infinite the mind actually is? I'm not sure. So when you have this vacuum of this entire landscape that has not been explored at all, you're missing out on just so much data that could inform your arguments, your philosophical theories, your ideas, your metaphysics. And I think that if more philosophers took seriously, like, the extent of the mind, and then the potential exploration of the mind, the extent to which the mind creates our sense of reality, and then also the exploration of the mind, I think that would really help push philosophy, academic philosophy, forward. I have no idea how I'm supposed to convince people of this, but that's just my particular bias. So,
And that was beautiful. Like, I completely resonated with everything that you said. Um, I guess something that's particularly relevant to what you just mentioned is this idea that I've heard Bernardo Kastrup. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his last name. I believe it's Kastrup. Yeah, I think it's Kastrup, right?
I think it is, yeah.
One of the things he's mentioned is that there is an emphasis in the realm of academia of asserting propositional knowledge of the form that is very, very idiosyncratic of Western philosophy, right? Like, so, like, A follows from B, or B follows from A, and it's all purely conceptual as opposed to something that's embodied and experienced firsthand. Um, and I've had this conversation, like, I mean, I've had this conversation with, like, people who are very successful in highly technical, logical, rational fields, and I've tried to, like, convey what you just said to them. Just the incredible importance of introspection and of the exploration of the mind subjectively. I guess that sounds tautological because the mind is inherently subjective, but my apologies for that. Um, so I've tried to convince these, like, sort of, like, I don't mean to, like, be disparaging or anything, but, like, rational types, like people who are just married to rationality in a way that perhaps precludes them from noticing things that transcend rationality. Um, and I just have a really hard time. And I feel like that sort of archetype, of the rational, super logical individual is something that largely constitutes it constitutes, like, the majority of, like, faculty in not only in philosophy but perhaps even more, you probably like in scientific fields and highly technical fields that are. I mean, I know there's a highly technical side to philosophy, but I guess like I think it extends even more broadly to other faculties. Um, and so there's this yeah there's just this discrepancy, right? Like that just places a there's a placement of like primacy on the discoveries that you can make through rational and conceptual thought over what you can discover, by sitting down for 3 hours in a dark room and perhaps inquiring on, your feelings, your perceptions. And but why do you think that is? I'm curious. Like, and what are some? Have you like stumbled into similar impediments when discussing with like hardcore materialists these topics?
Yeah, first thing, yes, 100%. To your question about these stumbling blocks when I try to discuss these topics with other people that are maybe more materialistic, uh, scientifically oriented individuals. Um, why do I think that is? I think that's a very complicated question, and in all honesty, I don't think I have like a full answer. But what I can say, at least to some extent, is that I think it's just where humanity is at in the 21st century. If you look at the education system, just the education system that we grow up in, and this is not just in a single country. I think that this is the way that our education systems are in multiple countries across the world. We emphasize science, we emphasize math, we emphasize logic and reason through just the scientific method. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but that is what we emphasize. And so as we're going through childhood and into adulthood, that is the bias that our education system is giving to us, except that it's giving it to us without us actually being aware that that's the biases that we are now holding. Um, the other thing that I think makes this so powerful, that these materialistic ideas so powerful, is that technology is so advanced. We are living in such technologically abundant times relative to the overwhelming majority of human history. And so it almost gives this false sense of authority to science or to rationality, because, hey, look at all of these amazing things that we have discovered and created as a result of this type of thinking. Therefore, this type of thinking is the tool we need to answer life's biggest questions. But if you actually study that line of reasoning very closely using a philosophical lens, it actually doesn't, there's nothing valid or sound about that argumentation. It's just, that's actually a belief. That's one of those, yeah, those things that, it's one of those beliefs that we have without even knowing that we have. So that would be why. And I think the other thing that I would like to point out about this whole emphasis on logic and reason that I don't think a lot of people actually understand, even philosophers sometimes. I do question whether philosophers actually have grokked this with their minds, but it's that at the end of every logical argument, or maybe I should say at the beginning of every logical argument, we are always starting off with some kind of assumption or some kind of just axiom, some kind of given that we are taking on as a belief or taking on as faith, so that we can then create an argument that follows. If A, then B. But why are we assuming A? Like, what is it about A that is so true? And what is it that grounds A's absolute truth or its ultimate authority? And I think people don't actually recognize that if you deconstruct deeply enough, there is no 100% foolproof logical argument. All logical arguments are resting on some kind of assumption, even something as simple as the sun will rise in the morning. That is resting on the assumption that the laws of physics are not going to change. How do we know that the laws of physics won't change overnight and that the sun won't rise in the morning? A lot of people might think of that and think that that's really poor reasoning, because why would the laws of physics change automatically or randomly? Like, there's no reason to think that that would happen at all. And I would say, yes, that's true. But from a purely objective standpoint, we do not know. You don't actually know if that's going to remain the same. So by saying the sun will rise in the morning, as logical as that can sound, or as logical as you can make that argument, on some level that is resting on a certain set of assumptions, one of which, for example, would be that the laws of physics remain consistent. We don't actually know that. Even though they've remained relatively consistent all our lives, we ultimately, we can't say that with certainty. So anyways, those are just a few of my thoughts regarding this.
No, that's amazing. Yeah, and I think Hume spoke about that, didn't he? Hume's problem, was it Hume's problem of induction, where he spoke about, like, he mentioned that, like the assumption that the laws of physics will continue to be the way they are is like a circular. It involves like circular reasoning, right? Because like
Mm.
you would you can't really know until you see it yourself. But yeah, and I guess this is like sort of like kind of like out there, to be quite honest. But I mean, this is like, I have like absolutely no evidence of this, but this just ultimately comes like from my personal experience. Given that I was raised in a traditional sort of Judeo-Christian background, when I was outgrowing those beliefs initially, and I was just like dispensing with the variety of different beliefs and things I thought about the world that had been ingrained in me since I was a child. um I felt like this sense of insecurity. I feel I'm sort of like psychoanalyzing myself. This sense of insecurity that the prior conception of a God that I held, that was like the only thing that was ultimately completely fixed, um had just vanished completely. And now I had to find something to replace it. And what was the thing I had to replace it with? Well, it had to be the scientific method, right? Science is as rigid and fixed and logical and indubitable as you could possibly want it to be. And in some sense, it provides that, in some sense, like not an identical sense, but like in a similar sense, it provides that sense of, security that the conception of a God would otherwise provide. I don't know, like that. Maybe that's like I'm just like projecting my own things onto like other materialists. But that's something that kind of like comes to mind. Yeah, I don't know if you have like any thoughts on that, or like something you want to mention.
Yeah, this starts, what you're talking about starts getting into how the sense of self is created, actually. So I completely resonate with what you're saying, and I think that actually what you're saying is very profound, because when people start getting defensive over their positions, almost getting triggered by like other people, that's sort of an indicator of where we're holding on to an identity. And you can see this pop up in literally like all types of circles, whether those circles are from religion, science, or even spirituality. Like, there are certainly spiritual communities where people have basically traded one belief system for another. Um, but we can become very defensive about our beliefs or our opinions. And I think that really, it speaks to the fact that these beliefs that we have about the world, no matter what they are based in feeling. They're not actually based in any sort of direct observation or direct experience, but they're based in feeling. And even something that emphasizes logic and rationality and objectivity as much as science does, ultimately, again, there are implicit beliefs that are holding up mainstream science. And so when you start challenging these beliefs, you're not just challenging the belief, you're also challenging the sense of self that has latched onto those beliefs, or that is being supported by those beliefs. If you go up to a scientist and tell them, hey, science is wrong, science isn't going to actually give you any sort of meaningful answers about the nature of reality, like, they might get defensive about that because that's their livelihood, that's their career, etc. So yeah, no, I think you're spot on. Like, I mean, even within myself, I can just observe sort of in real time, like, yeah, if someone started coming up to me and telling me like why meditation is bullshit and why it doesn't matter, like, I would probably get somewhat triggered from that, because there is some sense of self invested in, no, meditation is a good practice, meditation is a powerful practice. So yeah, I mean, like, we're very feelsy, we're very feeling oriented creatures. So I think what you're saying, yeah, it completely resonates.
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly like I think like yeah, I mean I think we're totally on the same page there. Like just that there's like a background of like emotions that is like propelling every quote unquote rational view that we adopt. Um but you know, now that you mentioned like the sense of self, I guess maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe we could, you know, talk about like how naturally distracted the mind is, and how when you're able to overcome that distraction, um, certain insights about the nature of the self um, start, you know, start like coming into your way or whatever. You start realizing certain things about the nature of the self. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. This is such an interesting topic. It was a point of confusion for me early on. Actually, Sam Harris was the one that I think I first heard the idea that the self is an illusion, quote unquote. And hearing Sam talk about this was just very confusing to me. Like, wait a second, you're telling me that who I am is not real? What does that even mean? And I actually, my bias at this point with where I'm at is that most spiritual teachers don't do a good job describing this one. Like, I find that there's not really good language around what that actually means. And to an unprepared mind, or to someone who's not very experienced with meditation, this is like not a very good insight to be like, you know, going around talking about. So I guess I would just say, for anyone listening, like, this needs to be grounded in some kind of formal practice. This is not another belief to be taken on, because if you take on, oh, the self is an illusion as a belief, that's a very easy way to just go into a nihilism rabbit hole, so to speak. Like, it's very easy to co-opt that insight, this very profound existential insight, and then turn it into a another belief that manipulates your view of the world, rather than an insight that actually liberates your view of the world. So there is a very stark difference. And I have seen, even in spiritual communities, people take this idea that the self is an illusion and totally run with it, totally manipulate it, and use it as a way to manipulate others. It's very easy to do. Oh, if I'm not real, there are no real consequences to my actions. That's some kind of line of reasoning that people will use. And that's not at all what I'm suggesting. And that's not at all what I would condone or support, personally speaking. So I just want to kind of give that warning message, I suppose. But what is the self? What is a sense of self? Um, so the sense of self is really a collection of perceptive experiences that are all manifesting. Excuse me, just one moment.
Or
My cat. Excuse me. Let me start that over.
we definitely
We
have
can
some
like,
pet problems. So it's
I
it's a
know.
mutual concern. um,
um, yeah, we'll start that over. So the sense of self is a collection of perceptions, basically. And these perceptions are essentially popping up so quickly, moment by moment, say like across time. So think of like the smallest scales of time possible, like less than a millisecond, just like really small scales of time. There are these flickerings of perceptions that are happening at such fast speeds that the typical mind and attention span can't actually penetrate into that activity. They can't penetrate into that subtle layer of perceptive experience. And they're happening so fast and so frequently over time that it basically just sort of gives rise to this mirage of experience. It's almost like if someone were to, or like a helicopter blade, like when it's spinning and the helicopter's going up, kind of just looks like there's this big circle on top of the helicopter because the blades are moving so quickly. It's giving the illusion that there's a circle there's some sort of physical object above the helicopter. Now we know that there's not actually a circle there. It's just blades moving really quickly. But that's in a similar way how the sense of self is constructed out of these strands of perception. So specifically, what are these perceptions? Well, there's mental talk. I think that's one that many people are familiar with. The mind is very chatty. So the mind is going on and on and on and on and on and on and on all day long. Even when we are not paying attention to the mind, like even when we're just going about our daily business, this mental talk and mental activity actually doesn't stop, which is a little bit strange because it like we can't, like we're not actually aware of how it's shaping our experience, but it's there. It's right there under the radar, hanging out with us all day long, this mental talk. Another very sneaky one is mental images. So very frequently we have a very subtle background image of our faces when we're speaking. And I'm sort of examining mindfully as I'm speaking right now in real time. Like I can see my face as I'm speaking. Like I can see my mind projecting what I think I look like as I'm speaking. And sort of just the mind is just throwing up this mental image of my body, of my face. And we're all doing that when we're walking, when we're talking. So you got these two mental forms of mental activity that aggregate together to give rise to a sense of self. You also have the physical sensations of the body. So physical sensations we identify with, we call that me, mine. What are others? We have our voice. So when we hear particular frequencies of sound, we identify with some of those and reject others. So like a car horn, for example, that's not us, but our voice, that is us. But part of the sound perception of, the physical sound that gives rise to the sense of self. And then our emotional sensations in our bodies. So emotions are certainly part of the sense of self. So you've got all of these different possible perceptions. And within each of those subfields of perception, there are just countless possibilities for what could come up. And then you start cross multiplying them, and then you've got this very complex sense of identity. And what's really, really strange is that all of this activity itself starts referencing itself across time, because we also have memories of ourselves. So through this self-referencing loop mechanism, you've got a sense of self that starts moving through time and space. But when you actually pay attention to the present moment, to absolute now, so to speak, if we were to truly pay attention to absolute now, it would be impossible for a sense of self to exist. There's literally no ground for a self to exist at that granular of a view, of a resolution of reality, like of true present moment reality. You can't have thought activity because thought activity requires time. You can't have like I don't know how in the weeds we want to get with this, but
No, you can
Like,
go as deep in the weeds as you
okay,
want.
okay. You can't have thought activity because thought activity requires language, and language requires time to make sense of itself. Emotions, you can't actually interpret emotions anymore, because all interpretations again requires the experience of the emotion and then the interpretation of the emotion. So that goes away. Physical body sensations, again, we're actually interpreting physical body sensations. That is what creates the sense of being in a body at all. But if you take time away because you're so locked into the present moment, well, you've basically gotten rid of your interpretive mechanism for body sensations. So that gets blown apart. So basically, all sense making that the mind is capable of doing requires some kind of activity, requires some sort of process or movement across time. But in these when you get into very deep meditative states, for example, or through other means such as psychedelics, that's another popular way to get to absolute now. Whether through chemical augmentation or contemplative practice, uh, when now is all that exists, all sense of reality stops being able to basically be created. And part of that, I think, like the most singular sense of reality that we have is the sense of like I amness, that I exist, that I am some kind of entity in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. So I know that was a lot.
No, that was a great explanation. I mean, you explained it very eloquently. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that comes to mind is, if, because I mean, I've had certain meditative experiences that have like led me to the realization that the state wherein you realize that the self is non-existent is actually desirable. But despite the fact that I have had those experiences, I feel like from the point of view of someone who's not so much familiar with meditation and these spiritual practices, I guess perhaps one of the questions that I would have maybe is, um, why is this something good? Like, why is the fact that there is no self something good and like worthy of? Why is this like an insight worthy of pursuing or whatever?
Yeah, it's very paradoxical because I'm with you. I think I'm like so down the rabbit hole at this point. I'm sort of used to people throwing that around, like, oh yeah, the sense of self being illusion, whatever, roll my eyes. But yeah, like if you're not familiar with this stuff, this can be very, very strange and alien and honestly disturbing. So yeah, why is this desirable? Let me give a sales pitch.
Okay.
One is that what we come to also discover through very deep and careful investigation into our experience is that um, a very large percentage, if not 100%, of our suffering comes from this sense of self. So when we deeply see that there is no self, we're also eradicating the possibility of suffering. Um, and by extension, we're opening up into a view of human happiness that is truly independent of condition. We discover the space needed for a happiness that is independent of conditions, meaning that we don't have to have like our egoic drives met to be happy. We don't have to like become, super wealthy, or we don't have to have like the perfect career, quote unquote, or like the perfect home or, car or even relationship. Like, and not to say that we shouldn't strive for things or we shouldn't strive for excellence or purpose necessarily. But what I'm saying is that wherever we are in life, we are capable of finding enormous amounts of happiness. And one of the conditions, quote unquote, that prevents us from tapping into that happiness is this sense of self, as strange as that is. And not just the sense of self, let me be specific here. The sense that the self is this enduring object, that we are like somehow object, this thing. When that goes away, our suffering can drop dramatically and our happiness can elevate dramatically. But this is not to say that we're somehow chasing after like an ego death state, or that we're trying to somehow like kill the ego or kill the sense of self. There's certainly still a self in a sense, even after we've seen into the self's true nature. It's just that instead of the self being an object, the self is seen to be an activity, very similar to how a flower blooms and then dies. Like if you were to film a flower over the course of its lifespan and then speed up the film, what we would be looking at is a very quick growth period, flowering, blossoming period, and then decay, death period. Like, imagine just speeding it up to happen in 10 seconds. So you can see the entire life cycle of a flower in 10 seconds. You would be seeing the activity of a flower. We would be observing the rise and fall of the flower as an activity, not as a single object. Like what the film would demonstrate is that there was never a single enduring object called a flower. It was actually this very, very beautiful, actually, process that was taking place, this fluid activity of flower. And so when we stop viewing ourselves as these like objects and instead observe what is this sense of self, what is this activity, well, we come to discover that it's an activity, it's a dance, it's this embodied poetry, so to speak, that the universe plays through us. And this allows us to tap into, counterintuitively, more of our highest desires, more of our deepest ambitions, because a lot of the things that hold us back in life is fear, fundamentally. And why are we afraid? Because we think we're something that we're not. But when we really start to discover what we actually are, we realize there's nothing to fear. And therefore, what is holding me back from expressing my most unique individuality? So my view of this whole sense of self is actually quite strange, I think. But in order to be who we are and express our individuality to its highest extent, we have to see what we are not first. And we are not a self. We are not an object. We are not a thing at all. We are this movement. We are the movement of reality, or the movement of the universe. And so I guess that's my sales pitch, man. Is like,
man, I absolutely
yeah,
love that. I absolutely love that. Yeah, I mean, it's just the dispensing with misconceptions about who we truly are, prior to like embracing who we want to be, and pursuing our genuine desire. I just love the way you phrased it. um I guess, I mean, there was like so many things I want to like I guess share with you something that I
please.
experienced related to no self. um but I don't know if like you wanted to like get into perhaps the sort of like the more practical things that you would do in any given meditation session to come to that realization over the span of like multiple months or years possibly. What does a typical meditation session look like for someone who's just starting out?
Yeah, for someone who is just starting out, I would recommend um, starting out with some kind of concentration meditation as a foundation. So a popular one is mindful breathing. I think a lot of people have heard of this in some way, shape, or form, but it's the technique where you're basically just following your breath. Typically, people will observe the breath sensations between the upper lip and the nostrils of the nose, and just observe those sensations as you're breathing in and as you're breathing out. And that's the technique. One thing that I would like to add about that technique, I don't know if you can hear my cat,
No worries.
but
I mean, my dog's been barking for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes or something.
yeah, that's fair.
Part of life.
Um, one thing I would like to add about to that technique though is, and this is something that I did when I first began as well, is I didn't just use concentration meditation. I also used a technique known as open awareness, which is literally just trying to be as aware as possible, without getting lost in thought. Thoughts can be there, thoughts can be doing their thing, and in either technique, thoughts are going to be popping up. So not thinking is not the goal. Not being lost in thought is the goal. But I would couple the concentration meditation with open awareness meditation as well, because you're actually training two different parts of the mind when you do either of those techniques. And so if, for example, if you want to meditate for 10 minutes, I would say start for 5 minutes, do your concentration meditation, and then for 5 minutes, do your open awareness meditation. If you would like to do one technique for the 10 minutes, I might say day 1, do concentration meditation. Day 2, do open awareness meditation. And then just undulate like that. If you want to get even more intense with it, you can add in a third technique, which I find to be actually pretty helpful for most beginners as well, which is some kind of either gratitude practice or some kind of like psychoanalytical meditation, almost, where you're tuning into yourself. You're just sort of gently asking yourself, how am I feeling? Am I feeling okay? Like, what's going on? It's almost like you're having this dynamic conversation with yourself, and you can just speak very quietly to yourself. Like, you don't want to, if you have roommates, for example, or if you're living with people, like, you don't want to necessarily disturb them, but having a kind of like a third person conversation with yourself, just stream of consciousness style, to see how you feel, to check in with yourself, almost like you're giving yourself therapy. Like, how can I support myself? Or like, how am I feeling? Why did my boss make me so upset? Like, they were just asking me to do a little bit extra at work. Like, what about that made me so upset? So like almost having this psychoanalytical conversation with ourselves and just checking in with ourselves emotionally. I find that practice was very, very powerful for me in the beginning. And it adds some variety as well to the whole, like, I'm just going to sit down and do nothing for like a set period of time. For the Western mind, that is very, we're all kind of addicted to technology, myself included. It can be very harrowing stepping into some sort of space that is so void of stimulation, such as meditation, that having a meditation practice that's more stimulating, let's say, not very, but having a meditation practice that's more stimulating, a little bit more engaging, I found to be really helpful when I was first starting out. It's not like an official, like, for example, Buddhist meditation technique, but Vinay Gupta, again, going back, the guy that sort of inspired me to practice an hour a day, that was one of the techniques that he suggested. And then on that front as well, speaking on emotions, I also think having a gratitude practice is really powerful, even for advanced meditators. Spending time and just finding things to be grateful for, extremely powerful and nurturing for us emotionally. So those are kind of the 3/4 techniques that I would offer for a beginner. Again, I want to emphasize you're going to be training different parts of the mind with each of these techniques. And I think one of the biggest roadblocks for beginner and intermediate meditators is that they don't have enough technique variety. We can really easily get into ruts with our practice if we're only practicing one technique. But when you start throwing in multiple techniques, this not only helps spice things up and make it more interesting, but it also trains different faculties in the mind, different parts of the mind that can show us blind spots that we may have not observed if we were only doing one technique. That all being said, there's also advantages with really sticking to a single technique and really hammering away at it. But I think for the beginner, that's not really necessary. For a beginner, the most important thing that we're after is consistency, just the consistency of the practice. And I find that, having a variety of techniques that you can fall back on is really powerful for a multitude of reasons, for the reasons I listed. So,
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, what you're saying sort of reminds me of, there was a period where I was meditating significantly more frequently. And one of the YouTube channels that I followed for multiple years now is, you're probably familiar with it. Some of the people listening on to the video probably are as well. Actualize.org. Um, and he gave like he gives you like different meditation techniques that you can use. And at the time, I was like exclusively focusing on an anchor, like having an anchor, and focusing on some particular perception, whether it was my breath, or the pressing of my buttocks against a chair or whatever, or a cushion. um and I felt like I was just like hitting some sort of roadblock, and getting a little bit stuck. The beginning of my practice had been filled with a lot of subjective of growth in terms of like subjective well-being, but then I had sort of like hit a roadblock. And then I stumbled onto one of his videos where he like spoke about a meditative technique called like do nothing meditation, which essentially involved just like sitting down and releasing the the pressure, I guess, the psychological or emotional pressure that you would have in a meditation context to focus on one particular specific perception. So instead of saying, "Oh, I'm supposed to like focus on my breath and I got distracted," you could say, "Oh, I got distracted. Now I'm not focusing on my breath. Now I'm thinking about, this other thing I need to do." And that is itself a perception, right? Like maybe I'm thinking about work, a thought about, a project I have to turn in at work tomorrow at 3 p.m., for instance. It distracted me from my breath, but that is itself another perception. And so it's like sort of like this embracing attitude towards the totality of the perceptions that enter your field of consciousness. um that I felt it was really helpful, and it's sort of like, not to use like not to trivialize the practice, but it sort of like boosted my my level of consciousness. If it sounds kind of like we're in a video game or whatever, but
that's awesome.
yeah, maybe we are, who knows. But
Right.
um but yeah, like and like, I guess, like how much time would you recommend people to start off with? Well, would you say like 5 minutes, like an absolute beginner? Should he or she begin with like 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
For from what I have observed, um, both with myself and just interacting with teachers, it feels like 10 minutes is kind of the minimum to really get a good benefit from meditation. There actually also may be scientific literature to support that claim. I haven't looked into it, but I've heard people say that there is science to show that 10 minutes is really kind of like the minimum effective dosage of meditation for like a formal practice period. Again, don't know if there actually is or not, or what that science would even actually show. Like we'd have to like dig into the research and then kind of read the methodologies and whatnot. But I would say 10 minutes. If you want to get consistent results, having a minimum practice period of 10 minutes is great. That being said, though, any amount is better than none. So even if that means a single minute, like go do that minute, like really give it your all for that minute and make that your practice period. If that's all that you have on a given day, like don't, as that expression goes, like don't should all over yourself, like just show up, like 1 minute is better than none. 30 seconds is better than none. So I'm a little bit liberal with that, but I would say if you are serious and you're seriously interested in seeing what meditation can give you, 10 minutes is a great amount. And I would also say if you're more interested in I don't know how we could phrase it, but if you're interested, I guess, in the existential benefits of meditation, you will probably need a large amount of it over many years. And so that's where I would start recommending like finding a way to get up to an hour a day. And the specific technique that I did to get to an hour a day, it was not a single technique. And again, I cannot take credit for this. This was Future Thinkers podcast. Go check them out. Their episode with Vinay Gupta. But what he recommended was, set it, get ready for 60 minutes of practice. Your first 10 minutes, you're going to do some kind of focused meditation. The next 10 minutes, you're going to do some sort of open awareness meditation. I actually think the do nothing meditation that you mentioned could also be a great substitute for open awareness, because do nothing is very open, and it is sort of emphasizing the quality of awareness. So that also works, but either open awareness or do nothing for the second 10 minutes. And then for the third 10 minutes, or for the next 10 minutes, do some sort of psychoanalytical meditation like I talked about earlier, or a gratitude practice or a metta practice would be great. And then you repeat that cycle again. So there's like 6 individual 10-minute segments of the sit. And the first cycle is 3 techniques. The second cycle is those 3 techniques repeated. I found that breaking up the 1 hour into those segments, that was the only way that I was able to do the 60 minutes. Like, I don't think I could have done 60 minutes unless I had broken it up like that. I don't think my mind was strong enough back then. So having those breaks like that, having those intervals really helps stifle the boredom, the lack of stimulation. One of the challenging qualities of meditation when you start doing longer sits is the mind's going to start spinning and wondering like, oh my God, how much time is left? I feel like I've been on here doing this for so long. I want to check the timer. All of that kind of BS goes away when we have, frequent interval bells telling us, oh, I've been sitting for 50 minutes. I only have 10 minutes left, or, whatever. So those are my recommendations.
Wow, no, that's absolutely great. Yeah, and I think in one of your I've been watching your videos these past few days, and one of the things you mentioned was the advice that Shinzen Young gives about like strong determination sitting.
Mm,
Um,
yes.
I think you mentioned very frequently in your videos, and this is something you place a significant emphasis on. It's this idea that like there's a certain, I don't know if Shinsen Young says this as well, but I think I've definitely heard you say it, and it's very much in congruence with my personal experience. Um, this idea that there are exponential benefits past the 1 hour mark, right? And so like if you compare, for instance, the amount of benefits, however you would want to measure that, um, you would get from, say, a 30-minute meditation, and you compare them to the benefits you would get from a 1 hour meditation, the latter would not be twice as much benefits, as many benefits, but would be like exponentially greater. And likewise, if you keep going up the ladder, right, from like 1 hour to 2 hours, and so on and so forth. Why is that the case? Like, why is it that like there's like past the 1 hour mark, or past a certain threshold, you start experiencing like just massively exponential benefits?
I think because in any given sit with meditation, let me just back up before I start. The way that I'm framing the practice is one way to frame the practice. There's actually other ways to frame how meditation works that are not how I'm framing it, that are just as valid, and in some instances, perhaps more valid. So I just want to throw that out there, that like, this is not what I'm going to describe. I would not say what I'm describing is like the answer to meditation or like how it works. It's just a way of framing it. And it's a very powerful and useful way. But it is, there are other teachings and frameworks that I think are just as powerful and helpful. But but yeah, let's dive into it. In a given meditation sit, at a microcosmic level, like what are we doing? We are cultivating mindfulness in some way, shape, or form. What is mindfulness? It's basically learning how to pay attention. Like, if I had to define it as like as bare bones and as simply as possible, I would just say it's paying attention. That's what mindfulness is. And as it turns out, we can really, really start to pay attention to to a degree that is mind-boggling. Like, it's mind-boggling how much we're not paying attention in our default state of mind. So that's what we're doing during meditation. Now, what we can notice is that at the beginning of the set, like let's say at minute 0, we have 0 mindfulness. And by minute 30, we have 30 mindfulness, like let's say level 30 mindfulness. We're gaining a level of mindfulness each minute. But what is interesting is that as we are linearly increasing our mindfulness, so to speak, from minutes 30 to 60, we're not going from 0 to 30. Now we're going from 30 to 60. And so when we're examining our experience with that mindfulness, like the second half of the sit, we are applying a level of mindfulness to our experience that we didn't have during the first 30 minutes. And so all of the benefits that we have when we apply mindfulness to our experience, we're actually getting more of those benefits during the second half of the sit than during the first half. Because again, we were starting with nothing. We were starting with 0 when we first began. But as we're building up more and more and more, we're sort of retroactively applying all of the momentum that we had during the first half of the sit during the second half of the sit. And so in that regard, like there's this sort of non-linear feedback loop that starts to take place as we're applying the mindfulness that we've been building across a sit. Does that kind of make sense, what I'm...
Oh yeah, 100%. It
Okay.
perfectly makes sense. Yeah.
And one further elaboration, this is actually also the same mechanism that's happening over the course of our meditative careers. It's almost like we become more effective at meditating the longer that we've been meditating, which is part of why it's such a challenging practice to get momentum with, because we're really asking beginner meditators to just take it on faith that this practice is going to give amazing benefits and rewards. A lot of the amazing benefits and rewards don't start to take place until there's been a sufficient amount of momentum built across a lifetime. Literally, a 1-hour meditation sit can be more effective to an advanced meditator. And more effective, it's like quotation marks more effective. They're both effective. Let me just say that. But in a sense, the 1 hour becomes more fulfilling, more satisfying, deeper, more profound to the advanced meditator than the 1 hour meditation session is for the newbie or for the beginner. And why is that? It's because of the momentum that has been built.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm understanding correctly, I think what I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. I guess this is how I understood it. Like, there is a much in the same way. Like, if you imagine like a bunch of like timelines, from the very small ranges, from like 0 to 10 minutes or 0 to 30 minutes, to like the very wide ranges of like 0 to 10 years, for instance. You could get like much in the same way that from minute 30 to minute 60, you already have a certain level of momentum. In a similar fashion, from your 5th year of meditating to your 10th year of meditating, you will experience an overwhelming amount. That momentum will carry through at a macro level as well. Is that like, did I get you right? Or
Yeah, no, that is 100%. And this is like, I think, such a powerful aspect of the practice that I actually don't hear meditation teachers talking about this very often. I've only heard Shinzen Young talk about this. Besides him, I haven't heard anything. other than just sort of reflecting on my own experience and observing this for myself. Um, but I think it's such an important part of the practice to communicate to people that are relatively new, because it helps give them a vision for what's possible. Like, I've seen so many meditators sort of just kind of give up before they've hit this growth curve. And maybe, maybe it's a stretch to call it exponential, but it's certainly non-linear. I'll say that it is not a linear growth curve by any stretch of the imagination. And I think if you look at it across a lifetime, and we were somehow able to like graph it, it would look somewhat exponential. I think that that's sort of what my intuition tells me, but certainly non-linear. It's not just this linear, one step after the other all the way, across our lives. There is this seemingly exponential growth curve that begins to happen to the practice and in the long term. Now, the other thing that I should mention, though, is that like most systems or processes in nature, things are very messy. So it's not like we're never going to run into challenges anymore. Like once we've hit this massive watershed of moment of our meditation practice, like, okay, that's it. I made it. It's going to be easy from now on. Like, no, that's another thing that I think we start to really gain appreciation of when we get serious with practice, is just how much work there is to do, just how much mind there is to work through. The practice, while from the big picture does have this nonlinear / exponential growth curve to it, in the short term, we can have moments, even days, weeks, or months, where the practice is really challenging. It's just very, 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 very challenging, even though in the past we've had very beautiful moments of awakening or insight or release, whatever. So it's much messier when you actually zoom into the graph and start looking at things in the short term.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I've heard certain spiritual teachers talk about the fact that you are inevitably gonna experience some setbacks, and that like it's only when you like zoom out that you really see like the progress. Um, wow, no, I mean, I'm just loving everything you're saying. I mean, I don't know if you have like any particular time constraints, or like just to like have an idea of um, like what's left to be discussed.
Yeah, no time constraints necessarily. Probably, I don't want to like make it too long for the viewers as well. I want to make sure that it's reasonable for them, but um, uh, I'd be fine if we wrapped up the next 15 or 30 minutes, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any like time constraints, but I mean, I just realized I forgot to ask you if like there was like a particular moment where you had to like leave the interview or something. Um, but yeah, like we can just because there's like some other things that I want to discuss with you. Um,
Yeah, let's dive into them. I don't
and
have too big of a time constraint, other than whatever works best for really like you and what you're envisioning the end result of the timing of this is.
yeah, yeah, I guess like we can go like a few more minutes, maybe like 20 minutes or something, and
Yeah.
see where it goes. Um, so here's the thing, like one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, like that I've like have a I've so far like had a somewhat difficult time um processing retrospectively, is this the different experiences I've had when it comes to no self. Um, so there was a time where in 2021 right now, almost 2022, there was a time where I was practicing much more avidly and consistently. What was probably like 2016, 2017, at around that time. And um there were so I was initially just like focusing on an anchor on a single perception, and then combining and coupling that with do nothing. And then I started doing another technique, which brought me to like levels of bliss that I had, hitherto never experienced. Um, which is like the neti method. I think it means like not that, not that. And like you probably know way more about it than I do. But I guess like the gist of it is relating back to what Ethan was saying about like the nature of perception and how like the self is just a collection of perceptions as opposed to like a fixed a fixed unitary object. So like the process of this technique is like you sit down, and then inevitably a bunch of like different perceptions are going to pop into your awareness. It could be like a thought, it could be like mental chatter, an image of yourself or whatever. And then the task of that you ought to like embark on is to like dissect each perception and determine whether or not that perception is constitutes your self, um your ego or whatever. And then I mean, maybe I'm like mischaracterizing it or whatever, but um I haven't like practiced it in a while. Maybe I'm mis wrongly explaining it or whatever, but um and the central task of it is um to find yourself. Like if you were to sit down and just like try to find yourself, like the central core of where you are, right? Like the center of perception. um how would you go about doing it? You would sit down in a dark room or whatever, and see what you can come up with, right? Like, am I this thought that I'm having? No, I'm clearly not that thought. Am I like this, I don't know, physical sensation that I'm having? No, clearly not that. And so the ultimate goal is to like, by negation, get to the realization that like there is no self, right? Like there is no. So I had certain experiences doing that technique, which I probably like didn't explain perfectly, but um, that led me to like this sense of expansiveness and this sense of just just my complete silence and complete internal silence. Right, there was just a state of mind that was just like so equanimous and so like devoid of any neuroses that I had and stuff. I mean, they were very brief periods, right? Like they were very short lived, right? Like just right after the meditation, maybe like 20 minutes after the session, I would have like this sense of bliss. But so right around that time, and like I've never really like used drugs other than like drinking a few beers and stuff. But I had never like experimented with marijuana or anything of that sort. I've never done psychedelics. Um, and it's for reasons that well, they're a little bit lengthy to explain, but I had never tried marijuana, right, which is even milder than psychedelics. And I was, on a trip with my friends in front of the beach or whatever, and my level of awareness had achieved like a certain like had just undergone a snowball effect, where I had been meditating for like 2 3 months, and so on a day to day basis, I was very conscious. Um, and I went ahead and like smoked some weed, and when I smoked that weed, let me tell you, man, like I just my world just completely fell apart, because it was like the sense of no self that I had took on a negative flavor, so to speak. And I hesitate to describe it as an out of body experience, but it almost felt like I was alien to my own body in a way. I don't know if that makes sense. Um, I looked at everything around me, and everything seemed so insipid, so um, just so like external to me. And I remember like consciously trying to like calm myself down by looking at my hand. Like I literally just like stared at my hand for like 5 minutes. I'm like, here I am, look. Like I was telling myself, like, "Oh, here you are, look, this is your hand, right? Like you're feeling fine." And I would literally like look at my hand, and my hand would be as external an object to me as like the cup that was like lying on top of this on top of a table or whatever, or the TV in the living room. Like there was this sense of like total nihilistic like emptiness, and it was not fun. Like it was not fun at all. um I don't like some people. I don't know if like that's something you could call like dark night of the soul, or like some people have that terminology. But I'm super curious. Like, what do you make of this?
Mm. Yeah. So just to clarify, in your report that you gave, you were practicing the neti neti method, which, just for those listening, that is a very, very powerful meditation practice if you're looking to open up into no self or emptiness. So that, just for your knowledge, Richard, and like I said, anyone listening, it's a very potent practice from what I understand. I haven't practiced it much myself. I've practiced self-inquiry, which is similar, not quite the same, but that is a very direct meditation technique for unraveling the sense of self. But let me go back. So in your report, you were practicing this, but you said it opened up and at first was very expansive, and I think you even used the word blissful. But after you took the cannabis, it almost took on a negative spin and became very dark night of the soul-ish, is what you used. But is that correct? Is it like, did it start off being a very positive experience and then it flipped, or am I misinterpreting that?
Oh no, so like I probably didn't explain well. So like those were like two different experiences. One was
Oh,
like prior to the trip where I was completely sober, and I
right.
was just practicing the neti neti method, and I felt like super the sense of expansiveness and bliss.
Okay.
And then the second one, I wasn't meditating. Like in the second instance, I wasn't meditating. I was just like on a trip with my friends, and I just smoked some weed, and this sort of internal state flooded my mind. And
Yeah. So I think, just like even in my own experience, anytime I take any kind of mind altering substance, I have to be ready for whatever to happen. It can be positive, it can be negative. Because I've also had negative experiences with cannabis or even psychedelics. Um, I've also had very positive experiences. So when we introduce external substances, yeah, I mean, there's no telling, to some extent, whether the experience will be positive or negative. So that's one thing. I mean, I think these medicines, these plant medicines, or even non-plant medicines like substances such as like LSD, for example, um, more entheogens, they hold a lot of potential and power, but they can also facilitate dark episodes like what you're describing. Um, in Buddhism, there is actually this process called the progress of insight. And it's described in a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel Ingram. Uh, I would recommend checking out Daniel's work. If you want to get even more historic with the text, it was originally described, I think, in a book called the Visuddhimagga, which is like a commentary on the Pali Canon. The Visuddhimagga is really technical and difficult to read, in my opinion. So I prefer Western teachers like Daniel Ingram. I prefer reading his work, and I find he's a very trustworthy source. So if you are interested in learning about this progress of insight map, so to speak, I would go there. The reason I bring it up, though, is because in the progress of insight, it actually delineates specific phases on this path of insight, so to speak. And one of the fundamental insights that we can have is no self, the lack of solidity to the sense of self. And what's interesting about this map is that I don't want to get like too into it, but basically the beginning is we have some sort of breakthrough into the nature of self. But then this can be followed by a period of the dark night of the soul, so to speak. And then at the end of this progress of insight, we open up into very powerful states of equanimity, acceptance, peace, etc. Fruition is one of the words that it uses. And then we can end up repeating the cycle again and again and again and again. And we sort of go through these cycles of deeper and deeper and deeper insight into things like no self or impermanence or suffering, or even this isn't technically on the Buddhist map, but even things like interconnectivity, I would say, is a form of insight. It's called dependent origination in Buddhism. So even Buddhism has its own flavor to it. So anyways, all kinds of insights that we can have, and depths of insights that we can have. What it sounds like you're describing in your report is that you had a breakthrough into no self. And then it almost sounds like the cannabis almost like launched you into the next phase of the work, which is the dark night of the soul, where you, correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost sounded like there was this sense of like disenchantment with your experience, or like disgust almost, of like, this is my body, but this isn't me. Like it was just
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. A sense of like complete dissociation from
yeah,
everything, like me,
yeah.
my body, and stuff.
And this can be a response to the insight of no self. The tricky part though is that I don't know how to effectively navigate those waters if it happens through the use of something like cannabis, because on the one hand, cannabis is very consciousness expanding. On the other hand, it actually hurts mindfulness. Once the trip is over, it can hurt mindfulness once the trip is over, and so it sort of disrupts maybe the sober process that happens if we're just doing it without any sort of chemical enhancement or augmentation. Um, so I say all that to say your report is very normal, actually, so to speak, and
That's good to know.
I wouldn't take that as a uh, indication that that's where it leads ultimately. It's actually just a roadblock, so to speak. It's just a street corner on the way there. As you continue to work through the no self insight or the impermanence insight, for example, other insights, you'll get through those periods. And sometimes this whole progress of insight map that I'm describing, like the process and the progress can happen so rapidly that we don't even see ourselves working through the negative phase. Like we
Wow.
can just work through things so effectively and so efficiently that we wouldn't have even guessed that we had a dark night of the soul. But if you were like really paying attention, maybe you would have noticed there was like a 30-second period during your meditation sit where like things got dark, but you just had so much equanimity and mindfulness and momentum that you just worked through it so seamlessly that you just brushed aside.
Wow.
Um, and then other times it's more intense. So like it can happen and be more intense and last days or weeks. What I would say as well, though, this is where concentration meditation can be really powerful to couple with something like the neti neti method, because the neti method is so intense, it's so specific to no self that it can be really harsh on the mind and the heart, even, so to speak, because it's just so deconstructive to our sense of reality. Concentration meditation, um, in the traditional sense, is used to cultivate deep states of tranquility and happiness. So the word shamatha is the technical word in Buddhism, but entering into states of shamatha through concentration, typically mindful breathing, these can help. These types of techniques and practices can help soften the mind and the heart, and make the mind and heart more receptive to these deconstructive insights that we've been talking about, so that you're less likely to enter into dark night of the soul periods. Or if you have entered into dark night of the soul periods, you can fall back on these more nourishing practices to open yourself back up and process the insight. So shamatha meditation can very literally help integrate and process insights that we've had, while also it's almost like you're fertilizing the soil of the mind to get the mind ready for a new level of insight, for like a new depth of understanding of no self or impermanence or the self, or whatever it may be. So hopefully that was helpful. I know, again, I'm throwing a lot at you, but if there are any questions about that or follow up,
Oh,
please.
thank you. I mean, I'll definitely look into it. I wasn't familiar with it, with that form of meditation, and neither was I familiar with Daniel Ingram. I'll definitely check him out. Um, yeah, because like that I feel like that's one of the things that like um maybe I've hesitated so far to like admit this to myself, but like maybe I feel like that's one of the reasons why I haven't been so consistent with my practice. It's because I fear getting to that point once again, you know.
Mhm.
Um, but having had not, that negative experience notwithstanding, um, the fact that I also had like very positive blissful experiences um, makes it very difficult for me to like not be motivated to pursue a spirit a strong, robust, healthy spiritual practice, because I just feel like that's the state I had, which is of course like the state of mind I had in the positive experience I mentioned, which is of course like nowhere near actual enlightenment, but it was nonetheless like something way better than anything I had experienced prior to that point, to that moment. I guess that state of mind is like almost like inherently desirable or normative or worthy of attaining, and it's difficult, like once you've seen what's behind the curtain, like it's just very difficult to like just turn a blind eye to it and say I'm just going to live a normal life and pretend that this doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
um, but I'm really curious about like what your experience has been with I mean I'm guessing I'm guessing, have you like experimented with psychedelic substances and stuff like that? um
Yeah.
what's it
So
like? I'm just super curious.
yeah, there's a lot. Um, so much could be said. I'll just open up first. I am very experienced with the classical psychedelics, magic mushrooms, LSD. I have some experience with NN DMT. I don't have any experience with 5-MeO DMT, which has been popularized by Leo at actualize.org. You mentioned him, so he's really been a pioneer for the 5-MeO DMT substance. I have not tried that though, so just throwing it out there. But my own experience, so when I first started psychedelics, I started using them like once a week. Like I was just very aggressive with them. I slowed down pretty quickly to once every 2 weeks, which I know is still really, in my opinion, is still very aggressive. So I did that for almost a year. And then I started slowing down and I did it like once a month. Then it was like once every 2 months. And now I'm down to like once maybe every 3 months. But I'm uh, probably not going to take them for quite a bit of time. I used to think that psychedelics were more powerful than they actually are, in my opinion. So I actually think psychedelics are less powerful than what I gave them credit for when I first began. And the reason for that was because of my first meditation retreat, where I basically entered into a more powerful state than I'd ever achieved on any psychedelics. And that state lasted for like 5 days straight. So it was like my first meditation retreat was just like absurdly powerful and profound to a degree that was untouched by LSD and mushrooms. But the reason I'm calling it more powerful is because it was more it just touched the existential questions of what it means to be human more deeply than I feel that psychedelics touch.
Right.
I think that psychedelics are more powerful if you are interested in exploring states of consciousness. Like if what really jazzes you is exploring the possibilities of consciousness, then yeah, psychedelics are going to be potentially more powerful than meditation. Now, that being said, I have heard some wicked accounts of advanced meditators and the states that we're capable of achieving without drugs. So to an extent, it may be possible to achieve very, very similar states, even weird states, with meditation alone using particular kinds of practices. But most people don't have that kind of time on their hands to start exploring those practices. So psychedelics are the answer. What are psychedelics like? Well, they do a couple of things that specifically that I think can be highlighted to emphasize their power. One thing that they do is they very aggressively drag the attention into the present moment. So like you cannot distract yourself on a psychedelic. Like it's almost like a chemical or a chemically induced form of mindfulness and concentration. Like your attention span just gets sucked into the present moment, and you can't not be present on a psychedelic. Like it's just impossible. And this is both very powerful, but also can be very negative if it's a bad trip. But it's also part of what makes the experience and makes it so rewarding and potentially transformative. The other thing that psychedelics do is that they create a sense of fluidity with perceptive experience. So this is, people have this idea of psychedelics being very wavy and like loopy and trippy. That's just experience becoming fluid. It turns out we can also make experience fluid in meditation. That fluid, wavy kind of spacious fluidity that you get on psychedelics, like you can start to reliably tap into that with meditation as well. So most of my meditation sets I have these days, I enter into some sort of state of fluidity where I literally feel like my body starts to become wavy. My vision starts to become really augmented and wavy as well. Even sounds can become, like
insane.
spacious. Yeah. So that's very, very possible to achieve with meditation, but psychedelics do it to a level that normally is unavailable with sober meditation. Even for myself, like I would say psychedelics give me more of that. But the reason that this is so profound and the reason I highlight it is that actually the sense of the world being a solid, sort of grounded, objective place is a mechanism of the mind. It's a mechanism of the distracted mind, actually, because when you're not distracted, the world becomes feather light and paper thin and fluid. Like it's not actually a solid place. It can feel solid, it can seem solid, but it's not actually solid at all. And the more deeply that we pay attention to our direct experience, the more that we begin to see, oh, the sense of solidity is just something that my mind is doing, but that's actually not an objective fact of the world. And psychedelics showed this to us very obviously. The problem is that it's so obvious on a psychedelic, many people then interpret that as being, oh, I'm just on a drug, that's why things are that way. It's like, no, actually things are like that in general. It's just that we're so distracted and numb to our experience that normally we don't observe that.
Yeah, that's now that oh, I'm sorry to like
But no, please
interrupt.
cut it.
But I feel like this was a good moment to like ask you about this. One of the things that we had talked about prior to, the podcast was the epistemological reliability of mystical
Mhm.
experience. Um, and I was just wondering because like there are what a typical materialist would say is, listen, these are just chemicals. You're just an evolved ape who ingested a bunch of chemicals and whose brain was altered in such a way so as to make him perceive that the world is fluid or whatever. So what do you have to say to like the stubborn, hard-headed materialist?
Well, there's actually multiple angles that we could take this argument. That's the first thing I'll say, is that there's a lot of holes in that argument. And in this podcast, there's too many holes for us to actually get into all of them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's one thing. The most practical and I think useful answer, though, that I would give to that individual is like, um, the authority that you're giving the sober mind is completely baseless. Like, there's no reason to trust the sober mind more, more than the chemically induced mind, because ultimately any state of mind that we are in is just a set of conditions that are uh, given to us. There's no one state that has more substance or truth, quote unquote, to it than any other state. Like the qualia, so to speak, we want to use technical philosophical terms, the qualia of the psychedelic state is literally equivalent to the qualia of the sober state. Or let's even keep it within the confines of sobriety for a moment. The qualia of a groggy 2 p.m. afternoon of work is just as equivalent as the qualia of, I just had, a shot of espresso in the morning and I'm jazzed up and ready to go for my day. Like, both of those states are just states. They're just mind activity. Um, there's nothing special about being groggy and tired at work compared to being jazzed up and ready to go for the day after your coffee. Like, both are just states of mind. Similarly, feeling one with the entire universe on a chemical or on LSD or on mushrooms, there's nothing special about that state compared to um, like just eating dinner, like
Yeah.
with your family. Like, both are just states. That's what I want to emphasize. Like, so in a sense, I'm agreeing with the materialist here. It's like, yeah, okay, there's nothing special about a psychedelic per se, but there's also nothing special about our sober state that we're making these arguments with. Um, I think the wise course of action then, if you realize that states are equivalent, is okay, well, why is it that there's this intrinsic fulfillment that I get out of one state over another? What is it about the psychedelic state where I'm merging with the universe? Why does that feel so special? Why does that feel so meaningful compared to my sober state? The other thing that I would like to point out in this kind of argument with the hypothetical materialist, is that the qualities of the psychedelic experience that make it so profound and special are the same qualities that we start to cultivate as a result of paying attention to our experience through meditation. Because again, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness fundamentally is just about paying attention. It's just deeply paying attention. And in a sense, I don't think the materialist would disagree with me, but when we pay attention more deeply, we're actually observing reality more objectively. Like, if you're paying attention more, that is a mechanism to be more objective, to understand things more objectively. And so, as it turns out, the more that we are paying attention to our experience with our sober minds, the more that our sober experience begins to reflect the very profound altered states that we experience on psychedelics. And that's not an accident. So
Wow. Yeah, I think that's a very good comeback to offer to the materialist.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think like even if you embrace the materialistic framework and just grant the proposition that ultimately it's all about, chemicals and biological processes taking place, um, you could just think of it as a multiplicity of different brain states, all of which are based on certain chemical permutations, say, but all chemical permutations are created equally insofar as like their truth validity is concerned, right? Like it's just
Bingo. Yeah.
um, but what you mentioned about attention was like super interesting. How could you like elaborate a little bit more? I'm sorry, I don't want to
Oh,
like bore you with it, but you mentioned something related to how the more you focus on something, the more objectively that there's an intrinsic relationship between the amount of focus that you have on something and the objectivity of the perception that you have of that thing. Something like that.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's a little complicated, but one of the byproducts of meditation practice is um, what in Buddhism is called purification. And so purification basically is the the cessation or the ending of craving and aversion. That's sort of the short story. So as we're meditating, we begin to crave less, we begin to be averse less to our experience. So let's take, for example, like, let's say that I am against guns. Like in the United States, there's a big debate about whether people should have the right to bear arms or whether guns should be illegal. How much gun control should we have? We're kind of cowboys out in the United States, but whatever. People like their guns up here. But let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm very anti-guns. If I were to look at a firearm, let's just say a standard pistol, and I'm suddenly emotionally charged and reactive because of that sight, I am not being very objective with just the physical image, the visual information, the raw perceptive experience of that object. I have interpreted that object as a gun. I have labeled it. I have emotionally reacted to it because I have a particular position that I'm trying to defend of like, oh, guns are bad. Um, Nothing about my experience in this example is objective, quote unquote. But what I'm suggesting with the practice of meditation is that as I begin to release these emotional reactions, this in this case, this aversion's popping up to guns, I'm then able to more objectively examine the visual information that is that object. And by moving in this direction of releasing my craving, my aversion, and then also focusing my mind and being able to pay attention without getting distracted in thought, I'm actually able to experience that visual information more completely. I think people don't, non-meditators perhaps don't appreciate how much more complete an experience we can have with our raw perceptive field. Because when I experience that gun, let's say, more completely, what happens is that I stop experiencing the gun as a gun. I stop experiencing the gun as an object, and I stop experiencing that object as being solid at all. It becomes wavy, it becomes fluid, it becomes spacious. Like the solidity that I typically give to a physical image evaporates. And the label of gun, quote unquote, the conceptual label that I give it, that evaporates as well. Like that's not an objective fact about that object. It's not an existential quality to that object. But turns out neither is the objectification of it. So there is no object actually there that I'm reacting to. There's just the visual information. And it turns out when I'm paying attention to it moment by moment by moment by moment, very carefully, I don't know how to describe it other than it becomes fluid. It becomes spacious. It becomes, and also like you can literally start to penetrate the arising and passing of that object moment by moment. Like it's not static at all. Like the bits of information in the visual field are in a constant state of impermanent flux. And so when I'm staring at an object, when an object loses its objectification, part of the reason it loses that objectification is because the perception is beginning to be observed as arising and passing, arising and passing, arising and passing. It's literally like pulsating into and out of existence moment by moment. And it's precisely this pulsating quality to our entire perceptive field that gives rise to things like change and impermanence. It's why things never stay the same. You know, we have 4 seasons, we have rotation around the sun, we have the passing of time, we have our bodies that age and die, born, etc. So all change, the reason change can take place is because of impermanence, and we can start to very precisely observe impermanence in our experience. And I'm making the claim that getting closer to that impermanence and lack of conceptual identification with objects is a more objective observation of them.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you get rid of the sort of like the clouding of like the concepts and connotations that you have attached to whatever it is, whether it's a gun or any other object.
I have no idea why that one came up. I just was like very emotionally charged object. I was like,
Yeah, no, I mean it makes perfect sense, and yeah, and the thing is, like, these kinds of things, like, they seem like they're very individual and very personal, like you personally individually need to get enlightened, but they ultimately leak into collective phenomena, right? Like if you have like a very conscious society that is able to like perceive things in the way you just mentioned, like its politics are probably going to look significantly different than one in which um, people don't have that high level of consciousness. But
100.
yeah, but I mean, I don't want to I don't want to like take more of your time. I don't know if, like, to wrap it up, is there something in particular that you would want to mention? I don't know if there's another topic that you want to close off with, or
Yeah, I would love to give just like a final word, which is just that like,
oh, by the way, just, I don't mean to interrupt, but Ethan Schaltegger, remember, his link is going to be in the description. Please go ahead and follow him. You are not going to regret it. He provides just wonderful, wonderful advice on meditation. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, um, please don't hesitate to do it. The link is going to be in the description, and so are the links of the books you mentioned.
awesome. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
The last thing that I'd just like to close with, yeah, is just meditation is probably the most important practice that you can be doing for yourself and for other people. So like you just mentioned, Richard, it isn't just an individual practice. It's very strange because yes, it is an individual practice, and it's perhaps one of the most personal practices that we can have for ourselves, but it touches every single aspect of our lives. And so when we are practicing meditation for ourselves and taking responsibility for our suffering and our happiness, rather than putting that responsibility on others in the world, we're actually also helping the world, because we're bringing that space of meditation with us. So I just want to emphasize that, like, I mean, this is like the most important work that humanity can be doing. And also, just if you look at if we look at the state of the planet, we do not lack technology. We don't lack knowledge. I mean, yes, there's always going to be room for improvement, etc. But what we're really lacking right now is just a collective wisdom and compassion. And that wisdom and compassion is one of the most beautiful byproducts of a deep meditation practice. And so, wherever you are with your path, with your practice, like just know that you're right on schedule. The beginning of the path is just as important as the end. But I hope I can just leave the listeners with the idea that, like, the significance of what this practice is really all about, which is, as you said, it's not just an individual thing. It is a collective practice, and it is a practice that I think the world is going to have to collectively adopt if we are going to face many of the challenges that are right around the corner. So I'll end it there.
Definitely. That's a beautiful message for people who are listening. And anyways, Ethan, thank you so much for your time. It was a tremendous pleasure meeting you and learning more about your thoughts, your insights. um, I mean, there's just like a plethora of topics that were left on the table that we could have touched on. I guess we'll have to, like, perhaps do another episode in the future sometime.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, I wish you the best of luck in all of your future endeavors. And maybe next time we see each other, you'll have like ridiculous levels of, of enlightenment.
Hopefully, that's the goal.
Right.
You too. Hopefully next
Yeah,
time.
definitely. Next time we see each other, I'm definitely gonna have more robust, practice.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Richard. It was a blast.
Thank you, Ethan. You too. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too. Bye.